All right, so today we're going to dig into this really interesting article from 2017. It poses a pretty provocative question. What if that feeling we all have that the world is just falling apart is actually completely wrong? Let's dive in.
I mean, it's a question you hear everywhere, isn't it? Is the world just falling apart? It feels like every single news alert, every headline, is just more proof that things are more chaotic, more dangerous than they've ever been. But is that feeling based in reality? Okay, so before we get into the data, let's just lay out what this popular narrative actually is. It's the story that a lot of us, maybe without even realizing it, have come to believe about the world today.
So the story goes something like this. Civil violence is at an unprecedented high. Failed states are popping up everywhere. Terrorism is rampant. And of course you see these absolutely horrific civil wars in places like Syria and Libya, and they just pour gasoline on this whole narrative. It paints this picture of a world that's just fundamentally broken. And hey, maybe globalization is to blame.
But here's the twist. The authors we're looking at today took a hard look at this narrative, and they say, nope, empirically, it's just wrong. And this, right here, is where things start to get really fascinating.
All right, so if the story of global chaos is wrong, then what's the real story? Well, let's see what the data from the post-Cold War era, the last 30-plus years, actually tells us.
First up, let's just talk about money. In the 30 years after the Cold War, humanity created more wealth than in all of previous human history combined. I mean, just let that sink in. That's a staggering, absolutely unprecedented level of economic growth.
And that wasn't just numbers on a screen. That massive boom had real, tangible effects on people's lives. It directly led to the single greatest reduction in poverty, disease, and food insecurity that our planet has ever witnessed. Ever.
And this is where it really hits our fears about violence head-on. The perception, right, is that there are more wars than ever, and they're deadlier, and the big powers are always on the brink of conflict. But the reality? The data shows that over those same 3 decades, the actual number of wars went down. They became less lethal, and direct showdowns between the major world powers, they've been incredibly rare.
Okay, wait. So if the world isn't actually falling apart, then what is happening? It sure feels like something is wrong. Well, the authors say we're basically misdiagnosing the illness. It's not a global pandemic of disorder. It's a really, really severe and devastating regional crisis, and it's concentrated right in the greater Middle East.
And the authors don't pull any punches, especially when they talk about one of the biggest spillover effects, the refugee crisis in Europe. They say the idea that 1 million refugees could somehow threaten the entire economic and social fabric of a continent with 500 million people, well, they just call it preposterous. The real problem, they argue, wasn't the people fleeing for their lives. It was the total failure of the political response.
So this crisis in the Middle East, it had these 3 huge ripple effects across the globe. First, you had the refugee flows, which basically exposed how bad we are at international cooperation. Second, you got the rise of ISIS, which conquered territory and then exported terrorism around the world. And third, it brought back this old-school great power competition, with Russia and the US and others all backing different sides in these brutal proxy wars.
And this is maybe the most important takeaway here. These absolutely horrific wars in the Middle East, they provide the powerful emotional fuel for that big story about global chaos. They make it feel true. But the authors are saying, look, these wars are a symptom, a terrible symptom, but they aren't the root cause of the real danger to the world order.
So, if it's not the wars, then what is it? What's the real existential threat to this international system that, let's remember the data, has actually made the world way more prosperous and peaceful? Well, the authors say we need to stop looking out there and start looking in the mirror. We need to look at the West itself.
And boom, here it is. This is the core of their entire argument. The single greatest threat isn't some foreign army or terrorist group. It's the collapse of support at home, inside the United States and Europe, for the very system of international cooperation that's been the bedrock of the last 30 years.
Now, this backlash didn't just appear out of thin air. You see, while globalization created literally billions of winners around the world, it also created pockets of losers. And those pockets were heavily concentrated in the working classes of America and Europe, who saw their jobs disappear. You mix that economic pain with resentment over migration and a feeling that you're losing control to big institutions like the EU, and you get this incredibly powerful anti-globalization movement. And, as the authors point out, this fire was often fanned by disinformation campaigns.
Okay, but let's get real for a second. Why should you or I even care if this cooperative order falls apart? What's actually at stake here? What does it mean for us?
Well, first, let's be super clear about what we even mean by the post-Cold War order. It's not just some fuzzy academic term. It's a real, tangible system. It's built on trade, yeah, but also on the really radical idea that the big, powerful countries can and should work together through places like the United Nations to tackle huge global problems, whether it's a financial meltdown or a brutal civil war.
And you know what? It actually worked. We can't forget this. This is the exact system that helped end more than a dozen vicious civil wars in the last 25 years. That cooperation wasn't just talk. It directly made the world a more peaceful place.
So this really lays out the two paths in front of us. Path 1, the cooperative order holds. We keep working together, managing conflicts, and slowly chipping away at violence. Path 2, it fails, and we fall back into what's called a self-help system. That's a world where it's every nation for itself, nationalism explodes, great powers go back to fighting proxy wars, and everything gets a whole lot more dangerous and unpredictable. And the authors make a chilling point. The US could flip from being the main player keeping the peace to being the main player tearing it all down.
And that brings us right back to today. Remember, this article was written back in 2017. So here's the final question, and it's a big one. When you look at the world right now, are we living through the consequences they warned us about? Has that real, existential threat they identified, the one from within, already started to unravel everything? That's definitely something to think about.